There's no time.
The time is
13
o'clock.
All right, it's Tuesday once again, and that means it's time for our regular episode of the 13 o'clock podcast. This is episode 122.
Damn.
The one before the Christmas special.
Yeah.
We got to figure out what we're going to do with the Christmas special.
Yeah.
I don't usually leave it this long, but I've been so busy. But this topic, I've been wanting to do this for like a year because I only just found out about this like not very long ago when I was doing research for my book, The Faceless Villain, the second one. And it's also been requested a couple times, too, by some of our Canadian listeners. So I'm excited that we're finally getting a chance to do it. And I've done actually a lot of... It's a very broad topic, and I've done like a lot of reading about it and a lot of research about it. So I can't cover everything that happened over the time. But, you know, I'll kind of give sort of an overview. And hopefully you guys will be interested enough to kind of look more into it because there's a lot of information about it out there. So we'll get into that a little bit later on. Now, let's see, what do we got for shout-outs today? I don't remember if I mentioned this before, but I have uploaded the audiobook files for The Faceless Villain Volume 2.
Yeah, just wait for those to process, huh?
Yeah, actually, last time I checked ACX, which was earlier today, it actually said the status of it was headed to retail. Okay. So I'm guessing that it passed all their little stringent requirements.
Yeah.
And so now it's getting to the point where eventually it'll go up for sale. So it shouldn't be all that much longer because I know a couple of you have asked about it. So it'll only be a few more days, I promise. And then it will be available for sale. Also, let's see what else. Our latest movie review was The Wicker Man from 1973, not the remake with Nicolas Cage and the bees and the bear suit and all of that. Not that one, the classic one. So go check that out if you haven't already. Also, check out our Zazzle store because I added some new products. Like I put our logo on some various different products, so you can check those out. I'm also still working on some new T-shirt designs. I'm doing a Kukulkan one. Then I'm gonna put on a shirt, and I'm probably also gonna put it on a mason jar because I have to.
Yeah, I gotta get one of those.
That's just how that's gonna go.
Yeah.
And I'm also I'm gonna do a Wandering Whim one and some other ones, so that should be up sometime in the new year.
Baby Cookie's jumping into a box.
Yeah,
over there.
so like if you hear like,
she's tearing up paper right now.
Yeah. That's her box that her Christmas presents came in, and I left it in here for her to play in.
She likes the box more than the presents. Well, she hasn't got the presents yet.
Yeah, she hasn't got the presents. She has been trying to like open them. She was trying to get in them when I was wrapping them, and I'm like, no, not till Christmas, even though she doesn't care. She's
making a nest in there.
She is, yeah.
Yeah.
Look at her. She's
ridiculous.
So cute. She's a ridiculous kitty.
Yeah. Tearing the paper.
She loves paper. She loves to eat paper. She loves to tear paper up. She comes in Mommy's office like in the morning. And she goes underneath my little thing. I have a little cubby with a little thing with a bunch of papers in it. And she comes in, she jumps in the cubby, pulls everything out, and then chews it up. And is like, all right, I'm done. Then she leaves. And then it's just this big pile of paper on the floor that I have to clean up. That's all right, though. She's having a good time. So other than that, I think that's probably pretty much... Oh, and we have 2 new patrons that I have to say hello to.
That's right.
First of those is Ollie. Hello there. Very, very appreciative of all you guys out there. And the second one's name is Mike. So hi, you guys, and thank you very much. Also would like to thank our fan Eric for another generous PayPal donation. He sends us one every now and again. It's really awesome and much appreciated.
Yeah. It's funny. We never really can break the 500 barrier. It'll almost get to 500. We'll lose somebody. You know, they got bills to pay. It comes back down. Then we get some new ones. Just bounces around right there around 500. Right underneath 500.
We're getting there slowly.
We'll get there,
it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, But we're doing good, I think. For as much, and like I said,
we don't have that many subscribers.
Yeah, true.
We're not even at 5,000, I don't think.
Well, we're almost at 5,000,
yeah.
aren't we?
Yeah,
I don't know. I haven't looked.
We make good Patreon money for the amount of subscribers that we have.
Yeah,
which is not very many.
Well, yeah, because I feel like
some people are like, why don't you guys have more subscribers? And I'm going to tell you, because we don't buy them. A lot of these shows actually buy subscribers and views.
Well, yeah.
And that moves them up in the algorithms. You know? So we don't do that.
I just want
That's
people
all.
to like the show because they like the show.
That's just regular, natural
I want you
numbers.
to like me for me, is what I'm saying.
That's natural numbers. So, you know,
that's
it's
what I
organic.
mean. It's like we've never. Well, not like I could afford to pay for viewers or anything anyway. But I wouldn't do that just because I don't know. It just.
I don't think it's that much. I think it probably wouldn't cost them. I don't know, $50 for 1,000 viewers, maybe.
I just feel like it's pointless because if there comes a point when a whole bunch of people are doing it, then you doing it isn't going to help you any. You know.
Evidently,
what I'm saying?
well, I got a friend that does it. You know, little Matt.
Yeah.
He says somehow he knows all these people in Southeast Asia, and he's like a promoter.
Yeah.
And all they do is follow, subscribe, and watch other people. And they have programs that help them do it.
Yeah.
It moves you up in the algorithms. Then you start generating
more natural
ones on top of that. So it's kind of like advertising boosts.
Yeah.
I've considered it, but
I don't know.
Like
I said, I feel like it's just kind of a thing where and this is why I don't usually pay for advertising, because I feel like if you can only pay, like, you know, you do these little Facebook ads and it's like $5, $10, $30, whatever. And it's like, I feel like you don't get enough back from that to justify. Right. It's like, if you can afford to pay a shit ton, then yeah, you're going to like reap a huge dividend from that. But if you can only afford to like pay like $100 a month, then I don't think it's like worth.
You see these people with millions of subscribers, that's not natural.
Yeah.
Or it didn't start off natural. You know, they got boosts.
That's unnatural.
Yeah, well, it's like those bodybuilders. You think that shit's natural? You're fucking crazy. Those dudes are taking roids. They're with it, you know. Some of it, you know.
No person can look like that without
not naturally.
Drug enhancement.
Well, especially these new bodybuilders. They look at Arnold Schwarzenegger and go, "Yeah, that'd be okay for like back then." You know what I mean? Classic physique. You know, fucking Arnold was roided out too. You know, the way some of these guys look now, it's just, man, I would never do that.
Well,
it's nuts.
It gets to a point where it just doesn't look human anymore.
Dude's biceps like big around my waist, you know.
You know what I mean? Ridiculous. It just starts to look strange and it's like not attractive. So I mean, you know, there's a point of diminishing returns with everything.
You only get so big, and then after that,
it's just kind of like getting plastic surgery. Like a little bit, you looks okay, but once you get to you start looking like somebody peeled your head back and stapled it on the back of your neck. You know what I mean? That's not good, and you can't move the muscles in your face. So I don't think that's pretty. But anyway,
that's like, what's his name? The guy from Cannonball Run. What was his name?
Burt Reynolds.
Burt Reynolds, yeah. Burt Reynolds' facelift. It was something else.
Every
time he turned around, I was expecting there to be a knot on the back of his head where they just tied it.
He did kind of look like, I just imagined like the plastic surgeon putting his foot on the back of his head and pulling. I know that's not how it works, but that's just what I imagined.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. So we thank the Patreon donors and the PayPal donors and everything like that. And again, I'll say at the end, if you want to financially support the show, blah, 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 I'll do that at the end. Now, like I said, this is a topic I've been wanting to do a really long time, and I've had at least 3 requests for this also. Now, this is how this came about. When I was researching Faceless Villain 2, which covers, 1960 and 1979, I started coming across all these unsolved murders that took place in London, Ontario, Canada. And I noticed that so many of the cases were written up in this book called Murder City by Michael Arntfield, who was a former London, Ontario cop and is later became a criminologist. And now he has a show called To Catch a Killer that he's on and stuff like that. So, and he also runs like a cold case society where he has like people working on cold cases. So I bought the book for research purposes and started reading it. And it turns out, and here's something that I didn't know, and I'm imagining a lot of people probably didn't know this either, is that between the years of 1959 and 1984, London, Ontario, Canada was home to the largest known concentration of serial killers in one small area. Here's the thing. This blows my mind. At the time in question, London, Ontario was less than 200,000 people population-wise. It's about 140,000, 150,000 people. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 9 serial killers were operating in that area during this time period. Now, in his book, he says, now, if you extrapolate to like a big mega city like New York City or Los Angeles, he's like taking into account their population density in the same time period. That would be the equivalent of 90 serial killers walking around in New York or LA at the same time, like during the same time period.
90.
Yes.
Not 9.
He said between 80 and
90.
Yes, like 10 times as many.
Yeah.
So this is some fucked up shit. And there's still, I mean, he has some theories about why it might be, like why this particular thing happened in this particular place. But nobody knows for sure. I'm sure it's like kind of a conflation of tons and tons of different factors, which also saw a spike in crime in other cities as well. But, you know, why this particular city, like, seemingly had the highest concentration of serial killers in the world at the time, as far as it is known, it's just, I mean, it's a crazy, crazy thing. So there were, in this time period, there were 29 of these murders. 13 of them, I believe, were solved and were attributed to 3 separate serial killers. Other ones, unsolved. But some of the other ones were attributed to, they know they were connected, they just never caught the person that did them. You know what I mean? 3 of the serial killers were caught, but there were other ones that were not caught. But they're still, you know, kind of, you know, like they knew they were connected because of the similar modus operandi and all of that kind of stuff. Now, what ended up happening with the backstory of Michael Arnfield's book, Murder City, which is like it's very good. I recommend it. I've read the whole thing through, then I've skimmed through it like 2 or 3 more times. What ended up happening was that there was a cop, a detective sergeant in London, Ontario. He started working there in the 50s, and he worked there until 1979. And since, you know, London, Ontario was not a huge, you know, metropolis or anything like that, so when all of these crimes started happening, they were kind of understaffed. So this poor dude got stuck with a whole bunch of these cases. Now, one thing that he did, and this was, you have to think that this was an era before the term serial killer had even really been coined or was even in common use. This was before the age of profiling on a large scale. They didn't really know anything about, you know, sexual psychopathy or any kind of paraphilias or anything like that, or, you know, things that would lead you to, oh, this guy's going to be a serial killer later on, you know what I mean, like early warning signs and stuff. All of that was either not really in the common vernacular, it wasn't really all that well known. But this guy, Dennis Alsop, seems to have had like an almost, it was just this kind of like weird sense of this type of thing. Like, even though he didn't have a way to explain it because they didn't have the vocabulary back then, but he really had an intuition for which crimes were related and stuff like that. Another thing was he was super, super dedicated. All of these crimes that happened in London, Ontario, and some that happened in other places that were not his jurisdiction, and after he moved and retired and stuff like that, he kept everything. He kept all the copies of all the case files, copies of all the crime scene photographs, copies of everything, put it all in boxes, and kept it in his basement.
So this guy was kind of like a natural-born prototype profiler.
Yeah, before there was even a word for that.
And what was his name again?
Dennis Alsop.
Okay.
Now, when he passed away in 2011, he knew that his son would be the one going through all his stuff. So his son found this big-ass, you know, treasure trove of all this stuff from all the crime scenes that if it had been left with the police department, it probably wouldn't have been kept because they throw things out after a while, you know, to make room for new stuff. Yeah. You know, and things get misfiled and stuff. Right. So he had kept all this stuff. So his son found it, Dennis Alsop Jr., and since he knew Michael Arnfield, and Michael Arnfield had been a cop in London, Ontario, he gave it to him. So the book Murder City is basically, I feel like if it wasn't for Dennis Alsop keeping all of this stuff, then maybe no one would have even known about all this stuff going on, like all these interconnected murders. Because like I said, and this happened in the United States too, in the 50s and 60s, there were jurisdictional problems. It's not like now where you can like upload somebody's DNA to a national database and in 2 seconds they're like, oh, Nick, it's this guy. Right. You know what I mean? They didn't do that back then. It's like they didn't even, like fucking towns didn't even talk to each other. It's like somebody could serial killer somebody over here and then they go to like a town or a province over and do the same shit over there and no one would connect them really unless they happened to go over there, and it's like it never happened.
Right.
You know what I mean? Same thing happened here. Same thing happened in Canada. So I can't cover like all the crimes that happened during this time because there was just so many. The vast majority of them were sexual crimes against women and children, both boys and girls, mostly girls. 3 of them were little boys. And like I said, there were so many killers and so many of them are interconnected, and they're not sure which ones are connected and which ones aren't. But we'll kind of go into that a little bit too. But this is just such an interesting thing to me. And it's like, I kind of want to go into it at the end. I was going to talk about it now, but maybe I'll talk about it at the end about why this particular city, ended up being this way, like I said.
Now, the book that you got this from was a book that you were researching out of to help you write
Faceless Villain.
Faceless Villain. 1 or 2?
2.
2. Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of these cases.
What was the name of this book? We should probably plug it.
Murder City.
Murder City. Okay.
Yeah. He's written another one. He wrote one called Mad City about Wisconsin too. Right. The capital city killings and all that kind of stuff.
Sounds like a good book.
But it's actually fascinating. Like I said, he not only goes into all the murders that happened and which ones were probably interconnected and stuff, but he also has a really good breakdown of different types of serial killers, different types of sexual killers, different type of rapist typologies. So it's just like kind of all the most recent research into types of serial killers and why they offend and all the different kinds of paraphilias that they have, and which ones are predictors of other things and
now,
stuff
what is
like
a paraphilia?
That. It's like a fetish sort of, but it's kind of like it's generally something that's connected with
like
a crime.
A turn on.
Yeah, but it's something that's weird. It's a particular type of fetish that if you have it, it's usually would lead you to commit a crime. You know what I mean?
Kind of like that Russian guy back
like necrophilia.
Yeah, like that Russian guy, I think it was back in the 70s in the Soviet Union. He was into those schoolboys, and he'd saw through their feet, through the shoes and everything. That was his paraphilia.
It's that type of thing. Yeah. It's any kind of...
Guy made a film of it. You can watch it. It's fucking bizarre. You see, the kid was dead, but he was edited. Did you see that? So I actually saw it. I saw it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah. He works. He was kind of like he was a school teacher, I think.
Yeah.
Something kind of like their version of the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
He was telling me he was making them taller by hanging them.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Now he'd resuscitate them too, but sometimes he'd let them die up there.
Yeah.
And then he'd cut through their feet with the shoes on it. That was his big thing with the hacksaw.
Yeah, that's exactly what a paraphilia would be. Yeah. It would be some kind of weird, specific, fetishistic
that you would have to kill somebody to get it.
Yeah, that you would have to commit a crime to get it.
Yeah,
because pedophilia, you don't necessarily have to kill the person.
Yeah,
but you know what I mean. It would result in an illegal activity.
Yeah, this guy here, he was into those schoolboy shoes. Wanted to cut them with a damn saw with the feet in it.
Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It really seems like a very specific...
Yeah.
And he actually, in Murder City, he actually talks about the psychologist John Money, who he's kind of controversial in other ways, but he actually did come up with a fairly reasonable sounding thing about why people develop these types of paraphilias. It's almost always men, not usually women. He thinks that maybe it's because usually a paraphilia develops in childhood. It develops around a particular person or a particular type of person or a particular object or a particular body part or something like that. And it usually comes about if the kid is punished or shamed for sexual behavior. That's usually something that happens. And he thinks that usually it's men because men are generally more visually oriented. Yeah. And so if something bad is happening to them, like some traumatic thing, like for instance, they get sexually, abused when they're younger and they fixate visually on a particular object or particular type of person, like a photograph or something like that, then that will kind of become imprinted. It will become imprinted during their childhood.
Weird.
So yeah, that's the theory anyway. So that was something that he talked about in there. But like I said, this is a really good book, not just for this particular time period, this particular city, but also just kind of a general serial killer profiling.
It must be kind of rare because, I don't ever remember fixating or imprinting on any one thing more than anything else.
Well,
I liked girls. I liked women when I was a little boy. You know what I mean? I liked them all, but it's not like things had to be a certain way.
Well, yeah, but see, that's because you were a normal person and had a generally pretty normal upbringing.
Somehow they get kind of fixated and hung up on something.
They said usually it has to do with someone who's like either their brain is messed up or their upbringing is messed up or both.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's it. It doesn't happen in healthy children.
I remember being like, by the time I was like 6 or 7, you know what I mean? I like those high stockings on women. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Shit, yeah. We'd come across, Playboy magazines and shit, you know what I mean? They'd get with them girls dressed in blow you away even when you were a kid.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And interesting, too, I think that sexuality develops at a pretty young age because I remember being pretty little and being interested.
Oh man, she's hot.
Yeah, being interested in sexual imagery and stuff, even when I was like 4 or 5 years old. Of course, I was, but I was never like my family didn't like shit on me for it because it's normal.
That was 70s. People didn't hang up. They didn't have hang-ups.
Well, some people's families did, and that's why they turned out to be serial killers.
Yeah, maybe.
Including some of these fucking people.
Yeah.
But so what I'm going to do is, like I said, at the end, I might talk a little bit about, why he thinks this particular city or, some of the reasons behind why this particular city might have turned out the way it did. But I also kind of want to go into some of the little specific crimes that happened during the same period and whether some of them were kind of related. Like I said, I can't go into all of them because there were a shit ton. So I'm just kind of going to summarize a few of them. Now, this one was actually, this was a little bit before the prescribed period of the book, but he mentions it in there just as kind of like I don't want to say like a teaser, but of like something that was kind of a bellwether of what was going to happen later on. And this actually happened in January of 1956, and it was a little girl, and her name was Susan Cadieux, and she was 6 years old. Now, her and a bunch of her siblings and little friends, they were playing like by a church, like in a little churchyard, and they were, messing around outside in the yard or whatever. Now, evidently, this guy walks up to them. He was described as a tall, thin, unshaven man between 35 and 40 years old, wearing a Russian-style fur or wool hat, a light tan or brown overcoat, and galoshes with heavy buckles. Now, he said that he's like, I have an appointment to meet with Father O'Rourke, who was, the priest that was at that particular church. So he did know what that priest's name was. He said, I have an appointment for him, so I'm just waiting around for him. And then he says to Susan, she's like, you have to come with me. I'm going to give you something. And so then like the other kids said that Susan turned toward them, like she took him by the hand, was like, okay. And then she was 6. Yeah. And then she turns around and she says, this man's going to give me something. And then they took off. Now, her brothers and friend, like the friend who was a girl, like kind of ran after, was like, wait a minute, I don't think that's right. And then she slipped and fell on the ice and like busted up her face. So then the brothers were like, it's fine. So then they just went home. Damn. And then, so of course, Susan never came back. Right. And then it's just weird how like naive, I guess, people were, but I mean, they were just
around
little
a church,
kids.
And he knew who the
priest was, so they didn't think anything was weird.
Yeah, they probably thought it was part of the church community,
Yeah, so that's probably what they thought. Right. So they've, obviously she gets reported missing much later that night after she never came home. But they didn't find her until the next morning. They found her about 2 blocks away. She had been raped. And she died of exposure, actually. So I guess she was just raped and left there, perhaps unconscious. So that's, like I said, that was kind of one of the first
Well, why did she die of exposure, though? There had to have been more damage.
That's what I mean. She was knocked unconscious, and she was just left out there. Huh. And her clothes were all torn up. She never regained consciousness. Right, yeah.
But we don't know how bad the damage was. Like, maybe she had been beaten on the head several times with something heavy.
Yeah, that seemed to be a pretty common... Yeah,
something's missing in that story.
Well, I'm just giving you this quick summary.
Yeah, but they're not giving us the coroner's report.
Yeah, well, it might be in the book, but I don't remember what I said. I just did a quick summary of it. That's what I'm saying. So don't always just go by what I'm saying,
because we don't have
because sometimes there's more information out there that I just didn't, that I didn't put in my notes because I was just summarizing stuff.
I'm because you can't just knock somebody out and then walk off and them die of exposure. They come to. So it had to have been massive head trauma. That's what I'm thinking.
sure it probably was. And like I said, she was only 6 years old.
Right.
So like I said, that was kind of the first inkling of shit that was going to go down. And this actually wasn't in London, Ontario proper. It was a little bit outside of it. So then there was another one. And this was actually kind of, this is a very, very famous case still. This happened in 1959. And this was the murder of 12-year-old Cheryl Lynn Harper, usually just called Lynn Harper. Now, she, her parents, like, were on, her dad was actually in the Royal Canadian Air Force. So she lived on the base with her parents, like in the married officers, you know, barracks or whatever. Now, so she's 12 years old. It's June 1959. She's hanging out with her friend who's 14, and his name is Stephen Truscott, and his parents also lived around there. And so they knew each other. So he's riding his bike, and she's on the handlebars. Now, according to him, he dropped her off at this intersection, and then he was riding off on his bike, and he turned around, and he saw her getting into a car. And then she was not seen alive after that. They reported her missing and all this other kind of stuff. 2 days later, June 11th, they found her body in a farm woodlot. She had been raped and strangled with her own blouse. Now, the horrible thing about this was that Stephen Truscott, 14 years old, was pretty much immediately arrested for her murder. Because they said, well, he was the last one to see her alive. He was known to hang out like around the woodlot where the body was found, even though all the kids hung out there because they knew the farmer. The farmer was kind of a younger guy, and like a lot of kids hung out there and worked there in the summer and stuff like that. And I think a lot of the shit that happened too was because the coroner, the guy who did the autopsy, he kind of said, he's like, oh, well, she died around the time that Stephen Truscott said that he last saw her. So the kid, like I said, he's 14. They put him on trial. Like 3 months later, they try him as an adult, and they sentence him to hang.
Damn.
Right? And it's like, and he's in jail for like a long time.
Right.
Now, eventually, you know, cooler heads prevailed. And they were like, "What? He's 14." He's like, "We can't hang a 14-year-old kid." And really, like I said, the only evidence they had was that one, he was the Latin. He admitted that he had been with her that day, and you know, so that was all they had. And it seemed like they were kind of trying to railroad him a little bit because this was kind of a crime that doesn't usually happen. And they're just like, "Okay, well, we just want to like kind of close the book on it and shit like that." So he's in prison for a long time, even though he's maintaining his innocence. Now, later on, he was eventually paroled. He changed his name. He married. He had children, had lived a normal life. But in the interim, this investigative journalist wrote a book about it where she pretty much said, look, he was railroaded. He didn't do it. And it caused this big stir. Like, even the judge that had originally sentenced him to hang was like, oh, well, that journalist should be put in prison for like public mischief and all this other kind of
Canada,
shit.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. Yeah. So, but the more like people started talking about the book, the more like, yeah, maybe he was kind of railroaded because it seemed like they sort of, you know, didn't look.
Well, they had no evidence to link him.
Right. Exactly. So it's just like, well, he was there, so he's the fall guy.
Yeah, that would never fly. That would never fly in any court in the United States except maybe like Louisiana. Texas, maybe back in the day.
Yeah,
they have to have some kind of physical evidence to link you.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this seemed like it was a rare type of crime. They just wanted to get it out of their face, and you know, so they were just like, oh well, you're it, pretty much. So honestly, like I said, even though he was paroled a few years later, he didn't actually get a formal acquittal until 2007.
Damn.
They did give him a large financial payout. He had been out of prison for quite a while at that time. Right. But even though, you know, they apologized and all this other kind of stuff, but his name kind of is linked with this murder, even though probably he didn't do it. Although it should be said that Lynn Harper's family were really mad that when he got acquitted,
well, they thought
much
that
later
he did
because
it.
they thought that he did it. But the thing is, there are a whole bunch of other suspects that they didn't really look into very much at the time. And honestly, I think one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Probably one of the ones that's most likely, I think.
Most promising.
That was the word I was looking for. Was this guy named Alexander Kalichuk. Now, he was also a suspect in Susan Caddy's murder, which had happened 3 years before. Now, he was also on this air base. He was like on a Royal Air Force base in the area. He was known as the base drunk. He also had previous convictions for exhibitionism, like exposing himself. At one point, he lured a 10-year-old girl into his car and showed her a bag full of women's underwear. So that type of stuff. And usually dudes, and he kind of goes into this in the book, usually dudes that start out as exhibitionists or peeping toms or something like that later develop these sort of attack paraphilias, become rapists and serial murderers and things like that. Not all of them, obviously, but it is an early indicator. So he had a lot of that kind of shit going on. He was in the area. And there were also he had some other like sort of minor convictions for that type of thing later on, like when he moved around. Now he ended up, they never actually got him on any of the murders or anything like that. He actually ended up in a mental hospital later on and ended up drinking himself to death in about 1975, I think it was. But he seemed a pretty likely suspect. There was this other guy. They've never given his actual name because I guess they don't have enough, they don't have enough evidence to and they don't want to like get in legal trouble, I guess. But he's usually referred to as Larry Talbot, which I'm like, oh, like from the werewolf movie. That's pretty funny. But yeah, so this was another guy, and there was another investigator that thinks that this Larry Talbot person might have been the guy that killed her. But the weird thing was the investigator who first put this guy's name forward. He's like, I first thought of him when this guy broke into my house and sexually assaulted my girlfriend and then shot me with a pellet gun.
Damn.
So he started investigating this guy, and that's when he started thinking that maybe he was responsible for not only like Lynn Harper's murder, but maybe a couple other ones as well. So he supposedly had like a shoe print that matched one that was found at the scene, and he had the same type of blood, which was type A blood that was found at the scene. Also, he supposedly, allegedly, had something called a rape kit in his trunk of his car that he carried around just in case he ever came across anybody. So that was like another one. But the sad thing, this is he goes into this, there's a long chapter about the Lynn Harper murder just because of the kind of miscarriage of justice with this poor 14-year-old kid that was just riding along with his little friend on the bike, and suddenly he's in prison for murder. So, so there was that whole thing going on. And then, let's see, this happened actually in 1963. This one, to me, sounds like probably the husband, but there was another similar one later on that might have been, but they actually usually include this one. Now, this is the murder of Margaret Sheeler. She had a husband named Philip. They lived in this house. Now, she was pregnant at the time. I don't think they'd been married very long. I think it was a shotgun wedding type of situation. Philip was kind of a drunk, kind of had rage issues, not super happy about having to marry this woman that he'd knocked up or whatever, allegedly. So it's a few days before, or it's a few days after Christmas. Now, apparently the Sheelers are supposed to be having a party. So like all these guests are supposed to be coming over at 8:00. So all the guests start getting there and Margaret is not there. And Philip is already half soused. And he says, oh, we got in a fight. She got mad. And then she stormed off to go to her parents' house. Right? Only problem was the car was still in the garage. It was freezing cold outside. She was pregnant, like I said. And her parents lived over an hour away by car.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, she was going to walk.
Yeah, so she's going to walk.
Yeah.
So they didn't actually find her for a month. A month later, they found her frozen body not really that far from her house. Now, her clothes had all been taken off. They were all scattered around. She didn't appear to have been sexually assaulted. They determined that she had not been killed at that spot, but had been killed somewhere else and then transported and dumped. One of the weirdest things they thought was that they didn't find a coat. So they said either the killer took it or she went out into the snow without a coat, or
she was killed in
Philip probably killed her in the house and then took her out in the car maybe and dumped her or something like that, which is what I'm thinking. Now, she also had an ex-boyfriend that had followed her when she married and moved to this new city. So they thought it's possible that the ex-boyfriend could have been stalking her and maybe saw her come out and, and then grabbed her and did whatever. So Philip or the ex-boyfriend were never, there was never enough evidence, even though to me, like I said, it sounds like the husband, because they said in the house, like I said, all the party guests got there and said that Philip was acting really weird and really nervous and said, yeah, she just took off. And then there was like a roast in the oven still and like half prepared food like on the counter and stuff. So it looked like there'd just been a fight and then some bad shit had happened. So there was actually another one that happened like that much later in 1978. And that was the murder of Irene McDonald, who was 31. And her husband actually was later convicted, but it was almost the exact same situation where he was like, yeah, we had a big fight and she stormed off and I don't know where she went. And then later on he got convicted for killing her. But although they never found Irene McDonald's body, but according to friends and acquaintances of Donald Spindler, who was the husband, he had bragged that he had killed her and then soaked her body in lye or acid and then dumped what was left into Lake Huron, which is why they never found it. So they never found the body, but he was convicted anyway, even though they never found it. So let's see where we're at. We're at 36 minutes. So I think I'm going to take a break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about some more murder cases that happened in London, Ontario during this time period when it was the serial killer capital of the world. And then we might talk about a couple of the reasons why this particular city, this particular time, why it happened in this particular way.
Because it was Canada.
I guess. Yeah. So we're going to take a break and we'll be back in just a minute.
Okay, everybody. Jenny's got some new shirt designs up. 4 of them. Really good ones, too. Atlanta Ripper, Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm, the H.H. Holmes Murder Castle, and of course, Demon Child, because man said he could. These are updated designs. I think they look really cool. Jenny did a great job on them. Really fun making, Jenny?
They were very fun, and thank you very much. I think they came out very good.
Yeah, they get really good. They're very high quality shirts. Jenny and I wear our own shirts at certain times when we're trying to put a spotlight on ourselves, and you can put a spotlight on yourselves. If you go ahead and pick up one of these shirts today, you guys are going to love them. Links in the description, www.zazzle.com at 13 o'clock.
Yeah, so go check out our store at www.zazzle.com/13o'clock. We got these 4 cool new t-shirt designs, plus all our old ones if you'd rather get one of the old ones. But these ones are awesome, and you should check them out.
They're also available in women's cut, and they look really cute. Jenny's got some.
So thank you. Go check them out.
The Faceless Villain, a collection of the eeriest unsolved murders of the 20th century, Volume 2, includes cases spanning the years from 1960 through 1979, featuring such infamous crimes as the triple homicide at Lake Bodom, the family massacre known as the Good Heart Murders, the serial killings of the Zodiac, Bible John, Jack the Stripper, and the Freeway Phantom, the slaughter of dozens of women and girls along the Highway of Tears and the Texas Killing Fields, and the mysterious death of suspected spy, the Isdal woman, along with dozens of other fascinating and horrifying accounts. Buy it now from Amazon in print, Kindle, or audiobook format.
Okay, we're back talking about all the murders, so many murders, that took place in London, Ontario, Canada between the years of 1959 and 1984, when it was ostensibly the serial killer capital of the world.
Yeah,
now,
Canada.
I know, it's really weird. I mean, like, New York and LA have had 4 or 5 serial killers running around at once, which is bad enough. But to have, 9 of them in a city this small...
Well, there's kind of a theory why it happened. We probably get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into that in the end. Like I said, I wanted to go over a few more, some more of these cases that happened. Now, let's talk about the case of Georgia Jackson. This happened in February of 1966. Now, she was in with the Jehovah's Witnesses. She was 20 years old. She worked in a suburb called Alamer, I guess is how you pronounce it. I'm not sure if any Canadians will correct me. She worked in like a, what they would call, I guess, a soda fountain type of thing, which, made milkshakes and shit like that. She usually closed it up at 6 o'clock. Now, this...
Closed early.
Yeah, well, it was, wintertime and
Yeah, I
it was
guess
freezing. Who the hell wants a milkshake when it's
Right.
fucking 10 degrees outside? Nobody, that's who. But yeah, so she worked in there. Now, she was last seen, she got off of work, and then somebody, apparently, who had been stalking her, said, hey, get in the car. Now, they later did catch who did this, and it was somebody that knew her, although they're not sure if he killed other people. So she gets in the car with him, and the car, significantly, that she was seen getting into was a gray, I believe it's a Ford Meteor, or is it? Yeah, I think it's a Ford. And now this was the same type of car that Stephen Truscott said that he saw Lynn Harper getting into when he turned around on his bike and saw her getting into a car. He said it was a gray car, looked like a Ford or maybe a Chevy, but he thought it was probably a Ford. So like I said, this could be the same dude. So they found Georgia quite a while after she disappeared. She had been raped and bludgeoned in the head 2 times with what appeared to be a bottle. One of the creepiest things was that the killer had taken one of her ears. There was also a strip of skin missing from her arm, which appeared to have been pulled off with teeth.
Damn.
So this is a specific type of, paraphilic, like I said, like I was saying before, there's a very specific type of thing with a guy, taking souvenirs and shit like that.
Right.
Now, this happened in 1966. They actually found out who did it in 1971. And it was interesting because the cops, this guy wasn't even on the cops' radar. They actually caught him because he confessed it because he was a Jehovah's Witness as well. And he actually confessed it to the elders, and the elders went to the cops and narked on him. So good for them. I mean, you know what I mean?
What was he thinking?
That's what, it's like he wanted to get it off his chest, I guess. And they were just like, yes, tell us everything.
I've turned over a new
and then
leaf,
they called
I'm
the cops.
going to tell you what I did. And
like,
I know
come
you
get
guys
this
will watch
fucker.
out for me because you religious people are so honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad they did tell because it's like I said, he wasn't even on the cops.
Handing him over to the fucking...
Yeah.
To justice.
Yeah. His name was David Bodemer. Yeah. Now, the creepy thing, he was married and he had 3 kids, and he knew Georgia quite well. He was in that bar all the time. Like, his job, he worked for the railway, and his job was to go around and look for damage, like on the railway line, so he could report, like, so the crews could come and fix it. So he was, one of your mobile killers, going from place to place. So, and like I said, Georgia Jackson, the victim, she had known his wife since she was a kid. So she knew him very well. And that's why she didn't think it was strange. Like when he was, coming at, he was sitting by the place where she worked and was like, hey, I can give you a ride. It's nice and warm and stuff. And she was like, they said she hesitated at first because she was like, oh, he's a married man. And she was very religious. And she's like, how would this look like me getting in the car? But then she finally got in there. But she didn't think anything of it. She'd known him for a really long time. And he ended up killing her. Now, they don't actually know, like I said, he was given life in prison, but he only served 10 years, and then he kind of went and disappeared. There were some other murders in some other areas that had a similar type of signature that they speculate might have been him, especially since most of the jobs he had, entailed a lot of travel. So, but they definitely know that he did that one, and he might have done other ones as well. Now, I want to talk about this one, too, because this one's creepy as shit, okay? And this one is also unsolved. This was the murder of Jacqueline Dunleavy. This happened in January of 1968. Again, it's a girl coming home from work. She was only 16 years old, so she was still in high school. 3 days a week, she worked part-time at this place called the Stanley Variety Store, which was owned by a guy named Joe Clark. Now, this was kind of like a variety store. They sold, like, housewares and candy and shit like that, but it was also kind of a hangout for some pretty shady characters, some criminal activity going on in there. Like, kids would come and fence stuff that was stolen. Joe Clark had some like bootleg stag movies and like porn and stuff, and he would like let his special customers come in the back and watch the porn and, you know, various other things. So there was like a lot of seedy motherfuckers hanging around there. And Joe Clark had a habit of hiring cute teenage girls to work there to kind of draw in even more seedy characters, I guess. And this ended up biting them in the ass big time, because this poor 16-year-old girl that worked there, she gets out of work at, 6:30, something like that, and she goes to wait for her bus. Someone sees her getting in what appears to be a white sedan, and she disappears. Now, they actually found her later on that night. The killer did not make any attempt to hide her body. It was very cold out. It was January. They had left her in the parking lot, which was a fairly busy parking lot. Left her out in the open, mostly naked. She was laying posed with her arms by her side and her legs together as though she was on a mortuary slab. She had obviously, her clothes were kind of scattered around. It looked like the person had driven her there in the car, had taken her body like about 30 feet, I think, or 30 yards, posed it there, and then gone back to the car to get her clothes and her purse and stuff and like put it by the body like it was some kind of ritualistic type of thing.
And
she
did this in the middle of the night?
No, it wasn't.
Really?
She was taken at about 6:30 p.m. and they found her at a little past 8 p.m.
Okay.
Like
so
some boys that were going through
that time.
So this was someone that was not afraid of getting caught. This was a risk-taking individual. They found traces of blood. I don't think she was actually raped, but they did find semen on her clothing. They found vomit on her clothing, and also blood. She had actually been strangled, and her face and head were also kind of beat up as though someone in a car had been like punching her. They actually got really good photographs of the tire tracks of the car that had left her there. And they said not only did this car have 4 tires that were from completely different makes and models, they were different sizes, but they said this car's alignment is the worst alignment we have ever seen, and we can't believe that this car is actually driving on the road in the wintertime with these mismatched tires and alignment this bad. So that fact, made them think, oh, well, we'll catch this guy like immediately. All we have to do is drive around until we find some junker with these fucked up tires.
Did they let that out in the public domain?
I don't know if they did. That might have come out later on.
Right.
Now, a very specific thing that they didn't find until they actually went and, were doing the autopsy on Jacqueline Dunleavy was that her killer had taken a pack of pink facial tissues, like Kleenex, that were wrapped in cellophane and stuffed it down her throat. Evidently post-mortem. So this was like a signature type thing. And there would actually be another one where this happened, although I'm not sure if they're linked or not. But so that was another kind of paraphilic type of thing where there was this tissue thing where he's cramming it down her throat. So yeah.
That may have something to do with that vomit.
Yeah.
Because was he raping her orally and she vomited?
That's a possibility.
And then later on he's stuffing things down her throat after she's dead?
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about this, I mean, because she worked at the Stanley Variety and there were a bunch of like fucking weirdos and pedophiles and exhibitionists and rapists and porn connoisseurs that were in and out of there all the time, they really had no shortage of suspects, but they never had enough to pin it on any one of them. For a while, they even thought maybe the guy that owned the store, Joe Clark, that maybe he had something to do with it because he actually sold the store and took off like not long after the murder. But they're not sure if that's because he knew who murdered her or if he had done it, or if it was because he was afraid he was going to get in trouble because, the killer went there, or all of his illegal activities within the store would be exposed or what have you. So, like I said, they don't really know, but they're assuming that it was somebody that frequented that place because, like I said, a lot of people that went there had committed other crimes in other areas, sexual assaults, pedophilia. One guy, when he was a juvenile, had killed a 7-year-old girl by hanging her and then jacked off while he watched her die. But since he'd done it as a juvenile, he'd, spent some time in the juvenile system and then was later let out. So this was the type of people that was hanging out in this place. So like I said, they had no
That's
shortage.
Weird fucking freaks back
They,
in the day.
well, that's what I mean. Well,
Yeah. It seems like it was more prevalent then or something. You don't really hear that.
I know. It's like, I wonder if it was, because now, like I said, when I'm reading this book and there, you know, and I've read other things, you know, from this time period, particularly, you know, in Canada and the UK and the United States, it seems like there was a lot of this fucked up kind of shit going on. Is it just because now it's not, like, you can have like these kind of like fetishes and stuff like that, and it does not really considered like deviant behavior? I mean, obviously pedophilia is, bestiality is still, but you know, just having normal like sadomasochistic,
there's like some kind of outlet for it now.
Yeah, it's like, it's not really considered all that weird, and so maybe there's not.
I don't think the repression really isn't there.
That's what I mean. So maybe
it's a dying
that
breed. I mean, you don't hear about this happening all the time. When's
Yeah.
the last time a serial killer has been discovered? You know, a couple years. And
Yeah.
and they don't really seem to be as dramatic or as prevalent as they used to be.
Yeah.
I think it's a dying breed, really.
It seems like it's giving way to mass murderers, like mass shooter type situations,
and it's
stuff
a different
like
profile.
that. And it's a different, and mass murderers and serial killers are completely different from a psychological profiling standpoint, are two completely different types.
It's not
of
sexually motivated,
right? And and most serial killings are, not always, but the large majority of them are. Even if there's no rape happening, it's still some kind of like power control, domination type of issue that sometimes is like sexually motivated. An interesting thing, and this is a little bit, it's not off topic, but this is something that I read in Psychology Today because I was curious. I was like, what is the percentage between of male to female serial killers? What's the ratio? I wanted to know what the exact ratio was. Turns out the ratio is 85% male serial killers, 15% female serial killers. Interestingly, among one-time killers, it's 90% male, 10% female.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing about female serial killers is that they tend to do it for much longer.
Tends to be children.
The average, well, it's not always. It's usually people they work with, or people they know, or people in their family, like relatives, things like that. They tend to, because they tend to like not rape corpses and torture people and stuff like that. They tend to get away with it a lot longer. They use less splashy methods, poisoning, smothering, things like that. They said the average for female serial killer victims is 9. That's the number of victims. They usually operate for 8 to 11 years. Always work alone. And the average for male serial killers is only 2 years before they get caught or killed. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And they said that women almost always kill for pragmatic reasons rather than, you know, they usually for power or for money or for other things, not for sexual.
2 different kinds of fucked up.
It is 2 different kinds of fucked up, yeah. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting little thing. I read it in Psychology Today. So I just thought I'd mention that. I also thought I'd mention too, because you were talking about a book that you read about like the definition of serial killer and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I noted that the definition of serial killers was actually changed in 2006.
Okay.
It now to be a serial killer, you have to have only killed 2 people.
Okay.
But there has to be a signature present, usually like some type of compulsion, some type of sexual signature, some type of fetishistic type of signature, idealistic, that is evident after the second crime. Like that they can immediately link those two, then there's like an actual, like a specific...
I'm not going to buy it.
No, I'm just saying that's what the new definition is.
But think about that. That means that Old West gunfighters could probably be defined as serial killers.
Well, no, not really, because
weren't.
it's not. No, because they don't have like a paraphilic signature. They're not doing it for
the
same
signature,
specific...
I would think, could you say that the signature was gunfighting itself?
I don't know. See, it's
Dueling
not the
and
same.
shit
It's
like
not
that.
the same.
No? Okay.
Because, like I said, it's not like a sexual... Because he's usually a sexual motive.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or something like that.
Those guys like to fight, though.
Yeah, but it's not the same thing.
Okay.
That's not the same thing.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I mean, sure, you could argue it, but I don't think that's like the same thing. They weren't really doing it for the same reasons, I don't feel like.
Yeah.
That's just regular guy shit.
Some of it had to do with cocaine. A lot of people don't realize that cocaine, cocaine
they were all
was
coked up
prevalent
back then, you guys.
It's prevalent
well, it was
in
legal.
the West. Yeah, it was legal. You could get it. You could get it from the dentist. And Doc Holliday, was a coke freak.
Mm-hmm.
He would sit there and just pour cocaine into his drinks all night long. I don't know if they snorted it back then. I don't think they did.
Yeah, I thought it was
I think
more.
they just drank it.
Yeah, they drank it.
Drank it in wine.
Yeah.
But same effect.
Yeah.
Not as efficient. You have to drink more of it, but it was cheap then. You know, they could get it. Evidently, he could walk around with a big old jar of it. But fastest gun in the West may have had more than one meaning. He's just jacked up, you know.
I think that's a new shirt right there.
Yeah, fastest gun in the West. Oh. Yeah.
I'm gonna shoot some shit.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Yeah, so
He's got that weird twitch. You better watch him with that weird twitch. Watch his hands. Watch his hands.
It's a hell of a drug, it is. Mm-hmm. All right, so
cocaine's a hell of a drug.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see. All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is Frankie Jensen. Now, this is actually one of the little boys that was murdered during this time period. This happened in February of 1968. Now, this little kid, he was 9 years old. He packs his little lunchbox and he goes to walk to school like he does every morning. Now, usually his older sister would go with him, but she was running late that day. So he was like, okay, well, I'll just go by myself. It was freezing cold and everything. So he goes, it's only like a half-mile walk to his little school or whatever. And he never makes it there. Now, the interesting thing about this was that initially, even though there had been a few murders before this, they weren't thinking murder. They just thought, oh, he got lost or he got waylaid. And then, but since they didn't find him overnight, they said, well, obviously he's going to be dead because it was freezing cold outside and he would have died of exposure and everything. Now, another thing, too, that I thought was interesting, and I said it's such a more naive time back then, I guess, despite all of this horrible shit going on, was that even though little kids who would take this shortcut through this little wooded area, like to get to the school, and they had been reporting for years that there were, like, old men and shit like that were, like, messing with little kids. They would, like, grab them and be like, hey, kid, rah, 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 and stuff like that. So it was, like, a known thing. But back then, police were just like, oh, that's crazy. You know what I mean? It's like nobody...
Don't sleep underneath bridges. It's trolls.
Yeah, it's like no one really thought that much about it. It's just kind of like when this other one, like, one of the suspects in one of the later cases, like, they go through his house and find, like, pics, like, child porn and stuff like that. And it's like, I don't know, like, technically, I guess it was illegal, but it wasn't really considered that big a deal, like, to have child porn in your house. They were just kind of like,
oh, it's weird zany shit. You're not supposed to have that. That's weird shit.
Yeah, it's like they didn't really. I mean, nowadays they'd lock you up forever, but it's probably rightfully so. But it's like back then it was just kind of considered, and even then, like old dudes like attacking little boys and little girls in the woods, and it's like they didn't really think to do anything about that.
Evidently, there was some weird shit like that going on in the Victorian era, the 1800s.
I wouldn't doubt it.
A lot of those little cherub drawings and cherub photos of little naked kids. Evidently, there were some guys that would collect lots of that.
Yeah.
Evidently, Lewis Carroll, the guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland, evidently was...
he had a little bit of that, yeah.
Yeah, where he's writing down in his diaries of that he's meeting these little girls, these little homeless little
Alice
girls.
Liddell, who he wrote that story for, was only 10 years old at the time. And he wrote some pretty... I read a book about it a few years ago. He wrote some pretty weird shit to her, even for Victorian times.
Yeah, they had pedophilia back then.
Yeah. It's just I don't think they considered it...
They didn't know what it was, so they just kind of rolled with it.
Yeah, it's like they didn't consider it bad, or so I don't know. It just seems really
and they weren't in. It was like what would you call it? Pornography would have been really taboo back then, but it was nothing to like have naked pictures of children in your house. Weird, just weird thinking. Like, oh, it's just innocent.
Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
No one ever thought that.
Yeah. Put some wings on him.
That makes it legit.
It makes it out so much better. Yeah, like the Romans. Yes, the Romans.
That makes it not porny.
Yes, yeah.
If you put wings on it, because it's fictional.
A lot of the Roman paintings, there's people having sex, and then there's animals in the background, and cherubs coming down and helping people have sex, and children's watching.
Let me help you with that.
Come on, man. Come on, man. You know what was going on.
That's what I mean.
People were something else.
That's messed up.
Yeah. I mean, emperors had islands, of little children dressed up like little nymphs and pans and satyrs and shit in their gardens, and you know what's going on.
Yeah, of course. But like I said, it's just funny that they didn't really
think anything of it.
see anything wrong.
Well,
with
ancient historians said that it was immoral. They, like Tiberius, Emperor Tiberius, is the
Yeah,
one that's
some
really
people
known
were
for
the
that.
voice of
They
reason.
didn't like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when he got tired of him, he'd throw him off a cliff. If they gave him a problem.
Yeah.
And Caligula was one of them. That was his nephew down there, and that's why he turned out to be a monster.
Yeah.
They had some freakazoids back in that period too.
They did, yeah. It's just well, there's been freakazoids since
Always been
human
freakazoid.
history. It's just that I think you hear about it more now. Like it's more okay to talk about.
We have a mechanism of freakazoid control. At
Yeah.
least when you're poor enough to be controlled.
Yeah.
Starting to come out that rich people do whatever the fuck they want. They run the system.
Well, of
I
course
think they do
do.
whatever
Like
the
I
fuck
said,
they
they always have.
Yeah, and they got guys in Saudi Arabia that have whole harems of children and women, and our politicians go over there and go hang out with those guys in Saudi Arabia. So what the hell's going on over there?
Yeah. Well, whatever they want, I guess. Like I said, you have enough money, you can shield yourself from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so like I said, they find no trace of Frankie Jensen. He has disappeared. Then a little bit later, like I said, they're still kind of like, oh, maybe he just wandered off or got lost or whatever. And then a witness comes forward and says, the day before that kid disappeared, I saw a car right by that path, and it was a white sedan, just like the one that had been seen picking up Jacqueline Dunleavy. So I don't know if these two are related or not. The victim profile is different, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They actually ended up finding Frankie Jensen on April 12th, 1968, and that was like 2 months after he went missing. They found him in a river. They said actually he'd been dumped off a bridge. If he hadn't got caught like on a little obstacle or something, his body would have just been carried out into the larger river or whatever, and they probably would have never found him. One interesting thing, and they didn't think anything of this. Now, Dennis Alsop, the detective I was talking about at the beginning, he actually did kind of think of this because there was another murder that happened like this one, and this was like a weird little detail. So they said they found Frankie Jensen's body. It was in the water. They found most of his stuff except for his boots. They found like his little thermos and his little lunchbox and everything. He was wearing his little undershirt and his regular shirt, but his pants had come off. And they determined that the pants had come off when he was thrown in the water. Like they weren't taken off by the killer and then thrown off, or you know what I mean? They'd come off like after he went in the water. Now there was another victim later that had the same thing happen, Scott Leishman. And Dennis Alsop noticed, he's like, the way that the pants were configured, like the way the belt was, the way the zipper was, they said that's something that the killer did on purpose. He loosened the pants so that when he threw the boys into the water, the pants would come off, and then the killer could think about it later on. That's what I mean by a paraphilia. He had a very specific fantasy, and Dennis Alsop was one of the first people to like relate those two things, or like think that's what I mean. So like they have these little like weird.
They're in the water now. Then pants are coming off in the water. Kind of freaky, dude.
That's what I mean. It's like these are very, very weird, specific little details and little fantasies that they have to, that they have to kind of fulfill. I know it's fucked up.
When you think about it, it's like childish in a way, very childish.
Well, yeah, and like I said, it's a throwback. It's usually something that happened to them in childhood, like
Yeah.
some kind of traumatic thing that happened to them in childhood that made them relate certain
It's like
things. It's like
primitive and childish and like immature.
Yeah.
Kind of.
And now another thing about Frankie Jensen's murder that could have related him to Jacqueline Dunleavy, but they're not really sure, is that Frankie Jensen also had pink facial tissues stuffed down his throat. But they weren't in a package this time. They were just like wadded up and stuffed down in there. Now, they did think, though, that because the victim profiles were different, because the way the bodies were left was different. I mean, Jacqueline Dunleavy, she was left in the open. Obviously, they wanted her found. She was left in a very posed position, a sexually humiliating position. Whereas Frankie Jensen, it looked like the person had like tried to conceal the body by throwing it in the water and hoping it would get washed out. So they're thinking that whoever killed Frankie Jensen had read about the Jacqueline Dunleavy and the tissue thing and thought he would do that like as a copycat signature. So they don't actually think that those two were related, but they think one was a copycat of the other. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That they were trying to like throw off the police is basically what they were trying. So then there was another one in March of 1968, another little boy named Scott Leishman. Like I said, same type of thing. He was actually a little bit older than Frankie Jensen. He was 16, but looked much younger. He was on spring break from school, and it was a nice warm day, so he was going to go out fishing. And he went to hitchhike out to a spot where he was going to fish, and he disappeared. He was found in May of 1968. And same type of thing. They found him in the water, and his pants had come off. Similar type of thing. So they think that he didn't have any tissues in his throat, but because of the pants thing and because of the way that the and they actually couldn't determine, like, they died from head trauma, so they don't know if they knocked them unconscious and they threw them in the water and they drowned, or if they hit them with something else and then they were dead and then they threw them in the water or whatever. They couldn't really determine because the water was really cold, so they couldn't tell how long they'd been in there. So those two are probably related. Then there was another one in August of 1968. Now, this woman was a little bit older. Her name was Helga Beer. She was originally from Germany, but had lived in London, Ontario for about 7 years. She had just newly divorced, and she was kind of going out with her friends and stuff like that. This one particular night, she goes to her old apartment building where some of her friends still lived. Now, she gets there sometime around 1 a.m. Like, the friend, who was a female, who she originally went to see, was seen to leave the apartment building with a suitcase, and then she got the fuck out of Dodge. I don't know where she went. They never could find her afterward. Now, Helga Beer was seen leaving the apartment with this guy who nobody knew who it was, but a lot of people said that he had this really, really round face and a really wide nose. A couple of witnesses commented on that, but they never found him either. Now, the next day, they found Helga Beer's VW Beetle, like, backed into a space at, like, a service station, and her body was inside it, and she had been beaten, it appeared, with a fist or perhaps an iron bar, and she was, like, stuffed into the space between the front and back seats. She had sex, but they weren't sure if it was consensual or not. They thought maybe it was the same killer as Jacqueline Dunleavy because she'd been left in a sexually humiliating position. Like, she still had the top half of her clothes on, but not the bottom half. They had taken the bottom half and kind of threw them around everywhere. So, there was that. And the sad thing about this one is because she was in her 30s and, not a little kid, and she was kind of, a swinging divorcee type of thing, as they said back then. Which would
be a normal woman today.
A normal woman, yeah. Like I said,
yeah.
They didn't really consider it normal back then, which is really sad. So she didn't get, the crime wasn't really as well investigated as some of the...
normal girls.
That's what I mean, as some of the other ones were. Because
dirty bitches, those whores.
Right, that's what I mean. It's almost kind of like a thing where... Oh, well, you divorced your husband and now you're out looking.
That's what happens.
That's what happens.
Yeah.
You're asking for it. Pretty much. I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas, if it's a little kid or a little teenager just going to school or going to work or whatever, it's like, oh, it's an innocent victim, so that's okay to feel bad about that, but just because, you know what I mean?
It was another era.
Yeah, it's fucked up. I mean, like I said, there's still a little bit of that now, but it's like a lot better.
Although, how much do we really know? I mean, we really weren't there. I mean, turns out that a lot of the things that we thought weren't going on really were going on, like, young adults in the 1950s, a lot of them lived with their parents, and a lot of most women actually worked, even though they were raised as housewives. There's a lot of shit that what they tell us.
Well,
isn't really
like I said,
what it
my
was.
grandmother used to tell me that all the time. Yeah. She's like, they have this thing like all the TV shows from the 50s, like, oh, woman stays home and does all the housework and man goes up to work.
Pregnant.
But it's like
that.
most of, I mean,
they didn't do that.
Well, I mean, I come from a very working class background. It's like pretty much every woman I knew, like older or younger, always worked outside of the home.
In Mississippi, my grandmother, she worked.
Yeah, my grandmother worked.
She graduated her whole life.
Yeah.
And she
later...
had kids and was married, and
Yeah, I mean, later she stayed home because my grandfather had, he worked at NASA.
I think my grandmother in Mississippi only stayed home for a little while when the kids were real young.
Yeah.
And then once they got to a certain age, they had nannies and they went back to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, so I think that's kind of, maybe that happened in the 70s, like, a lot more women went out into the workforce, but I mean, women were always in the workforce.
Yeah.
Before that. Like, especially, like I said, working class women, you couldn't afford not to be,
right.
Just like nowadays.
Even in the South, black women were in the working
of course.
force, and a lot of them worked in white households. Like I was told you, my grandmother, this is way back in the day, when she went back to work, even though she was married, it was always black nannies and, the house help is what they called them back then.
Yeah.
There weren't enough jobs in the normal economy in Mississippi for everybody to work. People just worked for other families.
Yeah.
Like you had cooks and yard people, just like you have now. We have guys that come and cut yards. You know what I mean? In Mississippi, it was just, back in those days, it was just the black people.
Yeah.
It's just, that was the reality of it. There wasn't enough jobs. There wasn't enough jobs for white people.
Yeah.
Back then. It's just another era. The way shit worked. Just funny how the movies of the time portray it in a way that it really wasn't.
I think that kind of happens a lot. We always tend to see the past in a rosier light.
Yeah.
I feel like
Yeah.
it's that whole nostalgia, rose-colored glasses type of thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So yeah, that's why I feel like a lot of people that, you know, that are old now that grew up then, I think they forget like how shitty it really was back then, and they just like remember the good shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I'm just saying, and it's like, you know, I try not to be like that about, you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. It's like, yeah, some shit was cool and everything like that, but I don't forget like how crappy a lot of it was either. It's like I wouldn't go back.
Yeah.
There's no way.
And also, you know, we're both kind of products of Southern families. The way the South is portrayed is not really the way it was.
Yeah.
Like I thought that in the pre-segregation days that there was very little contact between white and black people, and evidently I was reading some stuff earlier, especially around where my family comes from, Jones County, which is called the Free State of Jones. In pre-segregation was pre-segregation. You had black people and white people living together. They were actually getting married. And this was in the slave days they were getting married.
Yeah.
But they had free black people. It wasn't until segregation after slavery that there was actual physical segregation where those farmers didn't live right up next to each other.
Yeah.
It's just fine. Well, we're off topic.
Yeah.
We're just talking about the South.
You're running with Kukulkan.
I'm running with Kukulkan,
going
way out there.
And I still have
was
a bunch
thinking about
more stuff
just
to talk
thinking,
about.
yeah, just thinking about the past and how different it actually was. It's not the way it was.
Yeah, we were just
Taught to
talking
us.
about that earlier.
Right, yeah.
How the past is always portrayed in like this
In a way it
golden-
really wasn't.
This golden light, which like it never was. Like
Yeah.
that. And like I said, I think people talk about even in the case of like serial killers and stuff like that. Oh, shit like that never used to happen. Yeah, it did. I mean,
Yeah.
like I said, I've been researching this shit for like years.
Yeah.
And, you know, even as far back as 1902, it was all kind of horrible shit happening. But it's like, you know, you look back and say, oh, it was a more innocent time. Yeah, no, it wasn't. In fact, I think people back then were worse.
Right.
Honestly. All right, so the next one I want to talk about, this was the case of Linda White, and this happened in November 1968. Now, she was a student at Huron College, Western University, and she lived in a house with a couple of roommates that she'd also gone to school with. Now, on November 13th, she just finished a midterm in French, and she asked some of her friends, hey, you want to go down to the tavern that all the students went to? And it's like, yeah, we'll go blow off some steam because we finished our tests and all this other kind of stuff. And a bunch of them are like, nah, we'll go later or whatever. So she just, she got a ride from two of her buddies. They were male friends of hers that usually drove her around in the wintertime, so she didn't have to walk so far because she lived quite a long distance from campus. Now, they dropped her off a couple blocks from her apartment, and she henceforth disappeared. Now, the weird thing was that when she didn't come home, and then her bed hadn't been slept in and stuff, so her roommates started freaking out, and they started calling her family. Now, her brother John, drove over 100 miles from the home to come and help look for her. They look all over the campus. They look through the apartment. He checked the train station. He checked everywhere. Now, the weird thing was that the first time they looked through the apartment, they looked through her room and everything, and they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. When they searched the apartment again, they found Linda's clothes that she'd been wearing when she took the exam, and they were all wadded up and stuffed underneath the comforter on her bed. Now, they're not sure if they just missed that the first time around or if somebody came in subsequently while they were gone and they were out searching other places and put them there as some kind of weird signature or something like that. But that was a really weird detail. There was no blood on the clothes. They weren't, or anything like that. It didn't look like anything bad had happened. Or they didn't know if she had come back and changed clothes and for some reason stuck the clothes under there and then took off again. They didn't really know. Now, they actually did not find her for almost 5 years. It was 4.5 years later. They didn't find her until May of 1973. And at that point, they found there was a farmer, and he was kind of looking around his little area or whatever, and he finds this clothing that was wrapped around a surveyor's pole. And then they thought, oh, okay, that looks like the clothing that Linda White was supposedly wearing, or the clothes that belonged to her. Then about a month later, they find a skeleton. Now, this skeleton had clearly been posed by the killer. They said it was laid out. They compared it to Vitruvian Man, where the arms and legs, the Leonardo da Vinci thing with the arms and legs sticking out. One of the arms was gone, but they said that probably wasn't animal activity. There was some way that they could tell that wasn't animal activity. So they thought this might be kind of a David Bodemer killer type of situation where he took the arm, because remember he chewed off the arm of that one girl. So they thought maybe there was some connection there. But yeah, so they couldn't actually determine how she had died because she'd been out there so long. But the interesting thing was they said as long as she'd been out there, she hadn't been out there as long as she'd been missing, which meant that the killer had kept her somewhere for some significant period of time. Either they kept her somewhere alive or they kept her body frozen before they dumped it, like where it was found. So there was another one like that happened too later on that they think was the same killer. Now this one was Patricia Bovin. This happened in April of 1969. She was 22. She had also recently divorced her husband. She had 2 little kids at home. April 22nd, somebody just came into her house and basically stabbed her to death. And she was just laying on the floor in the blood, stabbed her about a dozen times. And left the 2 little kids, unharmed. They said when they first came in the apartment and she's dead in a puddle of blood, the kids were crying and, hungry and everything like that. And they said there was chairs and shit tipped over and they thought that there'd been some kind of robbery or some type of thing. But they determined that the little kids, and this is horrible, this is this detail always creeps me out. The little kids have been trying to get up in the cabinets to get food.
Right.
And they were just little, so it's like they were pushing the chairs over to the cabinets to get the food out because their mom was dead. They were in there for all that time. I was like, oh my God.
How long were they in there for?
It was actually, I think it was only a day or 2 until she got found, but still, that's all. I mean, they were little.
I wonder if they remember it.
God, I hope not.
Probably not. Yeah.
It's horrible. Now, Patricia Bovin, they think, might have been murdered by the same guy that killed this other girl named Victoria Mayo. And this happened in 1964. Now, this was almost the exact same thing. It was kind of like a break-in, or actually there was no forced entry. So it might have been, either someone that they knew or they were able to talk their way in. Same type of thing. Victoria Mayo, she lived in a house with her kid. Somebody came in, stabbed her to death, left the kid unharmed. Now, they actually did find out who did that one. Is this guy named Sandor Fulep. He was Hungarian. So they actually did match in 2000. They matched his DNA to DNA found at the Victoria Mayo scene. So they speculate that he probably killed Patricia Bovin as well, though he's dead now. So I guess they're never going to know.
You're talking so much, I put Baby Cookie to sleep. Look, she's laying on her back. With
Sorry, did I bore you, Baby Cookie?
Yeah, you guys got to see this.
Where is she? Where is she?
She's on her back.
Oh my goodness!
On her
Look
back,
at her.
with her feet up on the air. She's
Look
like,
at
you
her.
talked her to death.
Oh, poor Cookie. All right. Now we're getting too into this, so I'm just gonna skip some of the cases.
There's millions of these cases. It's probably about time we need to get in here with the what
all right. But let me talk. I just want to mention this one, and then I'll just mention a couple other ones really quick. Now, because this case was kind of a big deal. Now, this case was the case of Jackie English, and there's actually, if you want to go look, there was a To Catch a Killer with Michael Arnfield. They did a whole episode about this. This happened in 1969. Same kind of deal. She was 15 years old. She worked as a waitress in a diner that was in a department store. She leaves work one night, goes out to the overpass to catch a bus. Somebody sees her getting into the back seat of a car, so they don't know if it was somebody she knew or not, and then she disappeared. October 9th, they found her naked body floating face up in Big Otter Creek. The weird thing was everything of hers was gone except the killer had taken off her 2 clasp earrings and placed them next to her, almost as a weird thing. And there was a ring left on her finger, but that was about it. She'd been killed by a single blow to the back of the head.
Look who's coming.
Kitty's trying to jump up on the desk. Now, she had not obviously been sexually assaulted. They did find semen inside her body, but it was the same blood type as her boyfriend. And since she had spent the day before her murder with her boyfriend, they assumed that was probably consensual. They found some of her clothing later on, and there was a different semen profile on the underwear. So they don't know if the serial killer, there was rape, or if the serial killer jacked off into her underwear after she was dead or something like that. They were finding clothes of hers all over the place, in the weeks and months following the her body being found. Now later on, this woman named Elizabeth Harrison came forward and she said, me and my husband and kid
were at the diner where Jackie worked the night she disappeared, and we saw these two guys talking to her like at different times. They were both, she said they were both dark-haired. They looked very similar. She's like, in fact, they looked so similar that it could have been the same dude, like in two different outfits, like at two different times. She said that they were both talking to Jackie and that after the second conversation, she looked very frightened. Now, after Elizabeth Harrison came forward and the police produced a composite sketch based on her description, Elizabeth Harrison started getting obscene phone calls. She started getting, like someone would like knock on her door and then run off and like drive off in a car. She got a sympathy card in her mail, like somebody stuck in her mailbox, and inside somebody had written, "Watching you." And then really much scarier later on, she was out, she took her dog to a dog park, you know, one late afternoon, was letting the dog run around. She gets back in her car and this dude gets in the car with her, holds a knife to her throat. And then he says something about, turn the dome light on. I like to watch. I like to have sex with dead girls because they'll do whatever I want.
What?
Then he started slashing at her face. He slashed her face all up. He stabbed her in the thigh. You know, he fucked her all up. She actually, she ran him off, her and the dog. He took off and then she drove to the emergency room and they fixed her up. But they actually got a guy later on that they thought might have been him. His name was Gary or Fryer or Flyer, something like that. And he was actually a school principal. And she said she wasn't sure if this was the same guy that she had seen in the store the night that Jackie English was murdered, but she said his voice for sure sounded like the guy that kept calling her and threatening her over the phone. But he went to trial and he was acquitted. Now, for a long time, they thought maybe he was responsible for not only Jackie English's murder, but a couple of other ones, like from Soroya O'Connell, Linda White, because they think those three were related. Because they go through his house and found like all these weird photographs, like child porn. They found mason jars full of poop because evidently he was
into this
a fecophile.
Damn.
Yeah, so he had like a trunk with like all these poop-filled mason jars
Wonder
in it,
whose that was.
doing who knows what with, sticking his dick in there. I don't know what the fuck he was doing. But it's like, yeah, so this guy, he actually went on trial for attacking Elizabeth Harrison, but was acquitted. For a long time, they suspected that maybe he had something to do with it. But I think later on, DNA evidence exonerated him of most of the stuff that he was suspected of. But, you know, he seems kind of like a scumbag. I mean, jars full of poop, you guys.
Damn.
But yeah, so, and another
Like that smell.
I guess. Another creepy thing, too, is that not that long after Jackie English was killed, the killer took some of her stuff, like some of her cosmetics and like a little bag that had her name in it and stuff, and made like a little shrine in front of what was once her family home. Now, her family did not live there anymore. They had moved away not long after her murder, but I guess the murderer didn't know that. Right. So he left it like on a sidewalk in front of there. And then later on, that house burned down and killed the family that lived in there. And it wasn't Jackie English's family.
Damn.
And then Elizabeth Harrison, the woman who had been cut up, who said that she saw the people, you know, the night that Jackie English disappeared, her house burned down and her whole family died too.
He must have been doing it.
Both of the fires were ruled accidental. I'm like, yeah, I don't think so.
Statistically unlikely.
That's what I was saying. I mean, for those two fucking houses. There was also a whole thing with this case. There was a thing about a girl named Marilyn Hurd who they found, she actually worked at the store with Jackie English, was about the same age. And she tried to kill herself. They found her like in a street. She had overdosed or whatever. And they found a picture of Jackie English in her pocket. And on the back of it, it said, let the name of her killer die with me, or something like that. But she never would tell the police. They didn't know if she was just a crazy person, and she really did know. I mean, she did know Jackie English, but they don't know if she really knew like who killed her or not. So there was that whole thing. And then, let me see. Okay, so there were a couple other ones. Irene Gibbons, who was like an older woman, and she was actually killed in her house. Same type of thing. I think one of the last one in the series is usually Donna Alcock, which happened in October of 1983. And she had gone to babysit at the building next to hers. And I guess when the mom of the kids came back from the bar, she was super drunk. She had come back with some rando she had picked up at the bar. She said, hey, wait in the car. I'm going to go up and, you know, pay the babysitter or whatever. And then Donna, the babysitter, the mom gave her money and said, hey, why don't you go buy me some cigarettes? I'm too drunk to walk over there.
So Donna goes to the store to buy her cigarettes, and then she disappears, and then she turns up dead later on. So they were looking for the stranger in the car that this person had picked up in the bar. She was too drunk to remember what he looked like. Now, other than all of these unsolved murders, and like I said, I couldn't get into all of them. I had like a bunch more in my notes, but I didn't know how long it would take to go through all of it. A lot of them are in my book, so if you're really interested, you can read it, or you can read Murder City by Michael Arnfield. I also wanted to mention really quick that the three serial killers that were eventually caught in London, Ontario, were Gerald Thomas Archer, the London chambermaid slayer, so called because his 3 victims were all elderly women who worked as maids in hotels. And they were all stabbed. There was also a guy named Russell Johnson, known as the bedroom strangler or the balcony killer. For a while, he got away with murder for a long time because his MO at first was to climb up the outside of the house like fucking Spider-Man. He would go into people's houses, over through the balcony, and then he would smother them with a pillow in a way that made it look like they had smothered themselves accidentally.
How do you do that?
That's what I don't know, but it's like, so the first 4 crimes he did, they weren't even ruled homicides at first, because the women that he picked were on particular medications where it could have happened, like they took too many and then like they rolled over and smothered themselves in their sleep, which is what it looked like. So they actually didn't catch him for quite a while. He ended up getting convicted of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 murders, I believe. And then there was another guy, Christian McGee, called the Mad Slasher. And he actually ended up killing 3 women by slashing their throats. He would just come up to them in the street and slash their throats.
So what was up with this particular area? I mean, why this all happen here?
This is what is actually really fascinating to me. And what he says in the book is that it's probably a combination of factors. Like I said, serial killers were kind of becoming a big deal all over the place, at least in the Western world during this time. One of the things that he mentions is the highway system. Now, obviously, the U.S. serial killing, statistics went up, as our highway system got bigger. What most people don't know is that the Canadian highway system predates ours by 4 or 5 years. So, when this big highway system started to open up, London, Ontario, was suddenly, it was a small city. It wasn't like a little town, but it wasn't like a big, it was like in the middle, you know what I mean? Like a mid-sized city. But previous to that, it had been kind of isolated a little bit from all the rural communities around it and whatnot. And now suddenly it was opened up. So he thinks that's probably a significant factor. There was also, and this was actually one of the weirdest things that I thought, London, Ontario is actually considered, he's like, the same things that make cities attractive to marketers, like in the sense of test marketing, like we're going to try this new product in this town, we're going to open this new franchise in this town and see how it does before we roll it out nationwide. They're like the same thing that makes it attractive to marketers also makes it attractive to a particular type of violent offender, serial killer, sexual serial killers in particular. And that's because for some reason it's average in every way. It's average size, average population demographics, average income. It has a little bit of everybody. It has some little bit wealthy people, a little bit of students going in and out, some people that have lived there their whole lives, some, people that are working class, has like a lot of, factories and that type of thing where people work. The thing about London, Ontario as well is that it has like an urban center, but the outside of it is a lot of forest land. They call it the Forest City. That's what it's called, just like Detroit's the Motor City. So it still had like a park-like, rural atmosphere, even though it was a fairly large city. So there was a lot of places where you could hide. There was a lot of dumping ground type area. But the thing about it being completely average in every way, demographics wise, he said, you see a similar thing in cities in the United States, particularly Muncie, Indiana, Richmond, Virginia, Rochester, New York. He's like, where the demographics are completely average in every way, and they also have a higher than average sexual serial offender, profile. For some reason, that's the same thing. And particularly he's talking about Rochester, New York, because we did the show on the Alphabet murders which happened in Rochester, New York. And not only that, but there were some serial killers like Ken Bianchi, the Hillside Strangler, Joseph Nasso, who did the other alphabet murders in California, were from Rochester, New York. So the thing about London, Ontario is that not only did a bunch of serial killings happen within the city and its surroundings, but also some people that were born there did a murder there and then went on to become serial killers elsewhere, like they moved elsewhere. Their first official serial killer, as a matter of fact, was Thomas Neal Cream. And remember, we did a show about him a long time ago because they suspected that he might have been Jack the Ripper. He's the Lambeth poisoner. And he was actually from London, Ontario, and did his first murder there. And then he moved to London, England, and then started killing over there.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is the reason why it happened here is because it's a big area that's very average, and it's almost kind of suburban. So what you're talking about white middle-class people.
Yeah.
Which is fairly safe area.
Yeah.
So it's not very well defended. It's not a hostile region. People aren't really on guard.
And it's a bit isolated. It was and it was isolated until the highway system opened it up.
So it attracts white predators. They can move freely through there. It's not a well-defended area, and they can ply their trade and get away with it.
Yeah.
They couldn't do that in a tougher area. They'd get their asses kicked.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Too
maybe
dangerous.
that's what it is. Maybe they
It's
just
too dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. So they go to a safe area where the cute, soft girls are.
Yeah.
Basically, is what the deal is.
And like I said, where there's a lot of surrounding areas
areas
rural.
to dump them and stuff like that. Yeah. So it's a Spielbergian area.
Yeah.
Place where they can ply their trade.
But that was like one of the weirdest things. And they said, but he said the interesting thing though is that although it was during this time period at least the serial killer capital, the world highest concentration of serial killers, it's not actually the murder capital of Canada. That would be Winnipeg for whatever reason. I'm not really sure. But that's like mostly one-off murders, domestic disputes, things like that. This is serial killers.
The offenders were white. The offenders are probably working class or middle class, so they can move freely through there without being noticed.
Yeah.
They're going after their own racial group.
Yeah.
The preferred victim is a teenage girl. There's lots of them there.
Yeah.
It's a safe area where they're not really being defended. They're walking around. It's a low security area. So
I guess they're not as wary as somebody.
Wary. That's what I mean by not defended.
Right, would be in maybe another area.
Right, you go into a tougher area, then everyone's under lock and key, and the security is higher because it's more threatening. But they feel safe there, so the girls are just walking around for the taking.
Yeah,
really, from their point of view.
But according to him, I'm like once this book came out and all this kind of stuff about the geography of serial killing kind of came out. So now they're trying to like look at particular cities and like why their configuration would maybe be more conducive to particular types of offenders.
They have serial killers in the hood.
Yeah.
But they're going after a different...
Like the Grim Sleeper.
Right. They're going after a different demographic.
But it's rarer.
It's more rare. I think the people are a little more streetwise there. And the guys that are doing this are usually going after hookers in the hood.
Yeah. Well, like Lonnie Franklin was. And we did a show. And that's why I want to do a show about him because he's very unusual for a serial killer. You don't see a lot of... I mean, there's a lot of murders in the hood, but it's not usually serial killer type murder.
No, but when it is, it's black on black usually.
Yeah, but usually, like I said, it's usually
always with
crime. There's other crimes involved.
Yeah, serial killers almost always hunt within their racial group.
Yeah. So I feel like the same thing, and like you said, it might be just that the victim profiles, like you said,
Soft,
everything's
cute
very
white
average.
Girls in the middle class, and that's who's going after them.
That aren't necessarily, that are maybe a little bit naive. Not blaming them or anything like that. I mean, they didn't have any reason not to be naive.
It's a safe area, so their guards lowered.
Yeah, so that's probably why. And like I said, that probably explains a lot of places, but I feel like it was just like a perfect storm. And like I said, crime everywhere was going up, like in pretty much every large city during that time, just because of the socio-political upheavals and various other things at the time period. So it was just that combined with particular factors of London, Ontario, which specifically just kind of...
I always had this thing where it seems like the guys that commit these kind of crimes come from a time and a place where you're going from a very strict and kind of restricted kind of a culture into a more permissive culture. In other words, they come from a real uptight background, and all of a sudden it's now kind of a free for all.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the 60s happen,
Yeah.
and then the 70s happen. But these guys kind of have a 50s mentality where they're uptight, and they can't make that transition too well. They're like incels, and they start hating women for one because they can't get it. Other guys are getting it, and they can't get it.
Yeah.
And then there's weird fetishistic shit going on. It would the same thing would happen right now in a place like Saudi Arabia. It's very uptight. If you were to go in there and say open that place wide open and give it Western culture, there'd be a lot of serial murder would probably go on.
Well, because any big change,
'cause it's
cultural
that big
change like
big
that
cultural
is going to
change.
cause
Right.
all kinds of horrible things
Right.
before things stabilize.
Before things stabilize. It would
Because,
probably
I
take
mean,
20 years.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays, like I said, this whole serial killer thing in London, Ontario
Right.
took place from 1959, 1984. Now it's one of the safest places in Canada, but for a time there, you know, all that shit was going on in there, and it was just a particular upheaval in that particular
You're going to have these
place.
guys, all of a sudden these women are wearing miniskirts and they're walking around without veils or whatever. There's going to be guys that don't like that. They're going to go after them.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, yeah, and I think it's on a smaller scale, it's probably a similar type of thing.
Similar
It's
thing.
just,
It was happening in the United States and Canada.
Yeah.
And I think it had to do with the 60s happening. Sexual revolution of the 60s.
Yeah, I think that was a big factor for, all the way around. But yeah, like I said, okay, so like I said, this is like a huge topic, and I didn't even get into like part of the stuff I wanted to talk about, but that's all right. So if you're interested in any of these cases, like I said, I wrote about a bunch of them in my book, Faceless Villain Part 2, or you can read Murder City by Michael Arnfield, which is really, really good and really well written and goes into all, like every single murder that took place, all the solved ones and the unsolved ones, and talks about all the serial killers like in a kind of a chronological order. Plus does a whole bunch of stuff about serial killer profiling and stuff. It's like a really fascinating book, so I would recommend it. So we are going to wrap up episode 122. And remember, if you like the show, to like, share, subscribe on all your social media, share with all your friends and family. If you'd like to financially support the show, you can go to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/13o'clockpodcast, or you can go to our blog, which is 13o'clockpodcast.wordpress.com, and there's a link in the sidebar to a PayPal account if you'd like to give a one-time donation. It would be much appreciated. And remember to check out our last movie review, which was The Wicker Man, and I think that'll do it for this particular episode. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you next time. Bye.